She had arrived at Ashford Manor with a single trunk, a borrowed coat, and the quiet dignity of a woman who had already lost everything once and survived it. She was not there as a guest. She was not there as a charity case. She was there because the Duke of Ashford, James Cavendish, the most sought-after man in 3 counties, had looked at her across a crowded room 6 weeks ago and said, very simply, "Come to Ashford. You'll be safe there." And Elizabeth Voss, who had not felt safe in a very long time, had said yes. She would spend the next 3 weeks regretting it, and then, for the rest of her life, she would be grateful she hadn't left sooner. But that part comes later. The carriage turned through the iron gates of Ashford Manor on a gray Tuesday morning, and Elizabeth's first thought was not about the house, though the house was enormous, all pale stone and tall windows and the kind of quiet grandeur that whispered old money with every brick. Her first thought was, "He's watching from the window." She couldn't be certain. The glass caught the light in a way that made it impossible to see clearly, but she knew James. She had known him since she was 9 years old and he was 11, when he used to leave apples on the stone wall between their properties because he was too shy to hand them to her directly. 30 years might have passed, fortunes might have risen and fallen, and the world might have changed beyond recognition, but some things stayed the same. She stepped out of the carriage before the footman could assist her. Old habit. She had learned long ago not to wait for help that might not come. James met her at the door. He looked older than she remembered from their last encounter, though that encounter had been brief, accidental, painful in its own quiet way. There were lines around his eyes now, a steadiness in his face that hadn't been there in youth. He had inherited the dukedom young, buried his father young, and carried the weight of it in the set of his shoulders. But when he saw her, something shifted, just slightly, just enough. Elizabeth. Not Miss Voss. Not the formal address a duke owed a woman of uncertain standing. Just her name, the way he had always said it, like it was simply the correct word for something he had been thinking about. "James," she said, and then because she had promised herself she would not cry, she smiled instead. He took her trunk himself, waving off the footman. She almost told him not to, it wasn't proper, a duke carrying luggage, but she stopped herself. This was his house, his rules, and besides, there was something achingly familiar about the gesture, like the apples on the wall. The entrance hall was grand and cold and smelled of beeswax and old roses. A housekeeper appeared, a kind-faced woman named Mrs. Holt, who showed Elizabeth to a room on the 2nd floor, not the finest room, but a good one, with a window that faced the garden and a fireplace that actually worked. "His Grace asked that you be made comfortable," Mrs. Holt said, in the tone of someone who meant it. Elizabeth stood in the middle of the room after she left and breathed. No creditors at the door, no empty pantry, no father to worry about, which was a grief so fresh she still reached for it in the mornings and found only air. Just a quiet room, a working fireplace, and the strange, fragile feeling of being somewhere she might possibly be allowed to stay. She should have known it was too still. That kind of stillness, in her experience, always meant something was waiting just outside the door. She met the Duchess that evening. Margaret Cavendish came down the staircase at precisely 7 o'clock, dressed in dark silk, every silver hair in its correct position. She was a handsome woman in the way that cold things are sometimes handsome, precise, controlled, built for endurance rather than warmth. She looked at Elizabeth the way a woman looks at a piece of furniture she did not order and does not intend to keep. "Miss Voss," she said, "what a long journey you must have had." "Not so long, Your Grace," Elizabeth said. "I am quite well, thank you." Margaret smiled. It didn't reach anything. Dinner was polite. James carried the conversation, asking about the road, about the weather, small things, careful things. Elizabeth answered. Margaret watched. It was only later, when James had excused himself, and the candles were burning low, that Margaret leaned slightly forward in her chair and said, very pleasantly, "I do hope you'll be comfortable here, Miss Voss, however long your stay turns out to be." Elizabeth met her eyes. "I hope so too, Your Grace," she said. She slept badly that night, not because of the bed, which was perfectly fine, but because she had heard something in those words that she recognized from long experience. The sound of a door being held open just enough to suggest it could be closed at any moment. She had heard that sound before, in creditors' offices, in solicitors' waiting rooms, in the voices of people who held power over her and wanted her to know it. She had survived all of those. She told herself she could survive this too. James left on a Friday. He came to find Elizabeth after breakfast, hat in hand, and explained it with the careful patience of a man who didn't entirely believe his own explanation. His mother had brought news of an estate matter in Derbyshire, a tenant dispute, a boundary question, something that required his personal attention and couldn't wait. 15 days, perhaps 18. He would write. Elizabeth listened. She nodded. She did not say what she was thinking, which was, "This feels wrong." Instead she said, "Of course, I'll be perfectly fine." James looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. Then he said, quietly, so that no one else in the hallway could hear, "Margaret can be difficult. You don't have to please her." It was the closest he had ever come to a warning. She wished, later, that he had been less gentle about it. The carriage took him down the long drive and through the iron gates, and Elizabeth stood at the window until it disappeared around the bend. Then she turned back to face the house. Ashford Manor looked exactly the same as it had 5 minutes ago. Same pale stone, same tall ceilings, same smell of beeswax and old roses. But it felt different, the way a room feels different when the fire goes out. Margaret waited exactly 2 days. Not out of hesitation, Elizabeth understood that later. Out of strategy. 2 days was enough time for Elizabeth to settle, to exhale, to begin to believe that perhaps she had imagined the coldness at dinner. 2 days was enough time to make the first move feel almost reasonable. It began with the room. Mrs. Holt appeared on Sunday morning with an apologetic expression and a prepared speech about renovations in the East Wing, requiring a temporary rearrangement of guest quarters. Elizabeth's room, the good one, with the garden view and the working fireplace, was needed. She would be moved to a room on the upper floor, just temporarily, just while the work was being done. Elizabeth looked out her window at the garden. There were no workers, no scaffolding, no sign of any renovation whatsoever. She looked back at Mrs. Holt, who could not quite meet her eyes. "Of course," Elizabeth said, "I'll pack my things." The new room was at the end of a narrow corridor on the 3rd floor next to the linen storage. It was small and cold, and the window faced a stone wall. There was a fireplace, but no wood had been laid in it, and when Elizabeth asked, she was told, very politely, that the upper floor fireplaces were not in use this time of year. She slept in her coat that night. By the end of the first week, the shape of it was clear. Margaret never shouted, never made a scene. She was far too clever for that. Instead, she worked the way water works on stone, quietly, consistently, wearing everything down by degrees. Elizabeth's place at the dinner table moved, first to the far end, then to a smaller side table. "We have so many guests this week, I'm afraid the main table is quite full." The guests Elizabeth could count on one hand. The housekeeper, Mrs. Holt, who had been kind on that first day, became distant, not cruel, just unavailable, busy, always just leaving a room when Elizabeth entered it. And then Lady Victoire Ashby arrived. She came on a Wednesday, in a carriage that cost more than most men earned in a year, wearing a traveling dress that managed to look both effortless and expensive. She was tall and pale and extraordinarily beautiful in the way of a painting, everything in its correct proportion, nothing out of place, nothing that moved unexpectedly. Margaret received her in the main salon with a warmth Elizabeth had not seen directed at anyone else since her arrival. They embraced. They laughed. Margaret held Victoire's hands and looked at her the way she had never once looked at Elizabeth, like she belonged there. Elizabeth watched from the doorway for just a moment before stepping back into the corridor. She had seen enough. That evening, passing through the gallery on her way to her cold room on the third floor, she slowed in front of the portrait of James at 22, painted the year he inherited the title, before the lines around his eyes, before the steadiness. He looked uncertain in the portrait, a little lost. She understood that feeling. 10 more days, she told herself. He'll be back in 10 days. She kept walking. It was Margaret herself who came to her room that night. Elizabeth heard the knock and opened the door to find the Duchess standing in the corridor, perfectly composed, holding something folded over one arm. She didn't wait to be invited in. "We have rather more guests than anticipated," Margaret said, setting the folded item on the foot of the bed with the casualness of someone leaving out a spare blanket. "The household staff is stretched thin. I thought, given your situation, you might appreciate the opportunity to make yourself useful." Elizabeth looked at what had been placed on her bed. A servant's uniform, white apron, gray dress, neatly pressed. The room was very quiet. "I am a guest in this house," Elizabeth said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "You are a woman with no income, no family, and no formal arrangement with my son," Margaret said pleasantly. "I am offering you something to do with your days. You are, of course, free to decline." She let that sit for a moment. They both knew what declining meant. Declining meant confrontation. Confrontation meant Margaret going to James with a version of events Elizabeth could not yet counter, and James was not here. Margaret moved toward the door. "I'll leave it with you," she said, "in case you change your mind." The door clicked shut. Elizabeth stood in her cold room in her coat and looked at the uniform on the bed for a long time. Then she picked it up. The uniform fit. That was almost the worst part. Elizabeth stood in front of the small mirror above the washstand and looked at herself, gray dress, white apron, hair pulled back plain, and thought, if someone who knew me could see me now, what would they say? Her father would have wept, not for her particularly. He had never been that kind of father, but for the name. For the Voss name, which had once meant something in 3 counties and now meant a cold room on the 3rd floor and a borrowed apron. She pressed her hands flat against the apron and straightened her spine. 8 more days, she told herself. Just 8 more days. She learned quickly what Margaret wanted from her. Not hard labor. That would have been too obvious, too easy to explain to James upon his return. What Margaret wanted was something more precise. She wanted Elizabeth visible in the wrong places. She wanted her carrying trays past the salon where Victoire sat laughing with the other guests. She wanted her laying the fire in rooms where she would have to keep her eyes down and her mouth closed. She wanted, in short, for Elizabeth to become furniture. And Elizabeth, because she had nowhere to go and 8 days to wait, let it happen. She told herself it was strategy. She told herself she was being practical, sensible, that she had survived far worse than this and a week in an apron would not break her. She told herself a great many things in those first 2 days in the cold dark of her 3rd floor room, while the wind came in under the door and the fireplace stayed empty. Some of it she even believed. On the 2nd day, she was sent to Victoire's room. The room was everything Elizabeth's was not: large, south-facing, warm, smelling of expensive French perfume and fresh flowers that someone had arranged that morning. Elizabeth moved through it quietly, tidying what didn't need tidying, trying to be invisible. She almost managed it. "You're the girl James brought, aren't you?" Elizabeth stilled. Victoire was standing in the doorway to the dressing room, a string of pearls loose in her hand, watching Elizabeth with an expression of mild curiosity, the way one might look at an unusual insect. Elizabeth said nothing. Victoire tilted her head slightly. He never mentioned you, not once, in all the conversations I've had with his mother." She paused. "I thought that was interesting." She turned back into the dressing room without waiting for a response. Elizabeth finished tidying the room and left. In the corridor, she stopped and pressed her back against the wall and breathed through her nose until the feeling in her chest settled into something manageable. "He never mentioned you." She knew what Victoire was doing. She knew it was deliberate, calculated. A small blade slipped in at exactly the right angle. She knew all of this. It still landed. On the third day, she made a mistake. One of the older guests, a Colonel somebody, hard of hearing and perpetually confused about where he was, stopped her in the library and asked her something in halting French, under the impression, apparently, that she was a continental housemaid. Elizabeth answered him, fluently, without thinking. The Colonel beamed and shuffled away, satisfied. Elizabeth turned around to find Victoire standing by the bookshelf, one hand resting on the spine of a volume she hadn't been reading, watching her with an expression that had shifted from mild curiosity to something sharper. "Interesting," Victoire said again, just that one word. Elizabeth met her gaze. She didn't look away first. Later that evening, she was setting the side table in the corridor when she heard voices from the salon, Margaret's low and smooth, and another she didn't recognize, a man's voice, discussing arrangements and dates, and something about the Ashby family's northern properties. She didn't stop walking. She kept her eyes forward and her steps even, and she did not let herself think about what arrangements might mean, or whose future was being decided in that warm room while she stood in the corridor in a borrowed apron. 7 more days, she told herself. Just 7 more days. She was wrong about the days. The carriage came through the gates on the afternoon of the 3rd day, not the 15th, not the 18th, not any of the days James had said. Elizabeth was crossing the courtyard with a basket of cut herbs from the kitchen garden when she heard the wheels on the gravel, and she stopped. The carriage door opened. James stepped out. He was travel-worn, his coat dusty, his hair less ordered than usual. He handed something to the footman and turned toward the house, and that was when he saw her. He went very still. Elizabeth stood in the courtyard in her gray dress and white apron with a basket of herbs over her arm, and met the eyes of the man who had told her she would be safe here. Neither of them spoke. The wind moved between them. Somewhere above, a window opened. Margaret, perhaps, watching from the first floor. Elizabeth didn't look up to check. James opened his mouth, closed it. His jaw tightened in the way it always had since he was 11 years old, when he was trying very hard not to show what he was feeling. "Elizabeth." "Welcome home, Your Grace," she said. She walked past him into the house. James found his mother in the salon. She was seated by the window with her embroidery, the picture of domestic calm, as though she had been sitting in exactly that position for the past 15 days and nothing of any consequence had occurred. Victoire was beside her, a teacup balanced in one hand, laughing softly at something that had apparently just been said. They both looked up when James entered. "Darling," Margaret said warmly, "we didn't expect you until next week." "The matter resolved itself sooner than anticipated," James said. His voice was even. His face was even. He had spent the entire ride back 3 hours, bad roads, a wheel that needed changing outside of Matlock, thinking about the estate dispute, the tenant complaints, the boundary question that had turned out, upon arrival, to be almost entirely resolved already, and had required very little of his personal attention at all. He was beginning to understand why. "You must be exhausted," Margaret said. "Sit down. Victoire, ring for tea." "I'm not staying," James said. "I need to speak with Mrs. Holt." A small pause, almost imperceptible. Margaret's embroidery needle continued its movement without interruption. "Of course," she said. "She'll be in the kitchen at this hour." James looked at Victoire, who was watching him with that careful, composed expression she always wore, like a woman who had rehearsed for every possible version of this conversation. He nodded politely. She smiled politely back. He left the salon. Mrs. Holt was indeed in the kitchen. She looked up when he entered, and something moved across her face, relief, guilt, or some complicated mixture of both, before she arranged it back into her usual expression. "Your Grace, I wasn't aware you'd returned." "Miss Voss," James said. "Which room is she in?" A pause. "The east corridor, sir, 3rd floor." James had spent his entire childhood in this house. He knew every room in it. He knew exactly which rooms were on the 3rd floor east corridor, and he knew exactly what they were used for. And her original room, Mrs. Holt looked at the floor, Lady Victoire's party required. "That's enough," James said quietly, not unkindly, but with a finality that closed the subject entirely. "Thank you, Mrs. Holt." He went upstairs. He found Elizabeth on the 2nd floor landing, carrying a small stack of folded linens. She heard his footsteps and turned, and for just a moment, just a fraction of a second, something crossed her face that she hadn't meant him to see. Something tired and raw and very carefully held together. Then it was gone, and she was composed again, and he thought, not for the first time, that she was the most quietly formidable person he had ever known. "Elizabeth," he stopped in front of her, "put those down." "I'm just... please." She set the linens on the window ledge. She folded her hands in front of her. She waited, with the patience of someone who had learned to wait for bad news without flinching. James looked at her, the gray dress, the white apron, the plain hair, and felt something tighten in his chest that he did not immediately have a name for. "How long?" he said. It wasn't a question exactly. She understood that. "It doesn't matter," she said. "It matters to me." James, his name, not his title, a small thing, but he noticed it. "You've only just arrived. You're tired. There's nothing here that requires." "How long, Elizabeth?" A silence. Outside, a bird called once and went quiet. "Since the 3rd day," she said. He said nothing for a moment, then, "I'm sorry." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and something in her expression shifted just slightly into something he couldn't quite read. Not anger, not forgiveness. Something in between, something still being decided. "It's your house," she said, "and your mother. You are my guest." "Am I?" She said it simply, without accusation. Just a question hanging in the air between them. "What exactly am I, James? You brought me here and you left and you never said." He opened his mouth. And then, from the floor below, Margaret's voice floated up the staircase, calling his name, telling him Victoire's father had arrived and was waiting in the study, and would he come down, please? It was important. Elizabeth watched him, waiting. "This conversation isn't finished," he said. "Of course," she said. She picked up the linens. She walked away down the corridor. James stood on the landing for a moment longer than he should have. Then he went downstairs. Lord Ashby was a large, affable man who shook hands too hard and laughed too loudly, and had, James noted, brought a solicitor with him. The solicitor sat in the corner of the study with a leather case on his knees and the particular expression of a man who already knows how a meeting is going to end. James sat across from Lord Ashby and listened to a great deal of pleasant conversation about county matters and mutual acquaintances and the exceptional quality of the Ashford wine cellar. Margaret sat to his left, composed and attentive. The solicitor in the corner did not move. Eventually, with the manner of a man who had been working toward a point for 20 minutes and was finally arriving at it, Lord Ashby said, "I expect your mother has spoken to you about our proposal." "She has mentioned it," James said carefully. "Victoire is very fond of Ashford," Lord Ashby continued, "and I hope that you and she might find you suit each other rather well, given the opportunity. He smiled. "The financial arrangements would be considerable. My solicitor has prepared something for your review." The solicitor opened his case on cue. James looked at the documents being laid on his desk. He looked at his mother, who was watching him with an expression of perfect, patient confidence, the expression of a woman who believes she has already won. He thought about Elizabeth on the landing. Am I? He thought about what he had intended when he brought her here, what he had not yet said, what he had been circling for weeks, carefully, the way he had always circled things that mattered too much to risk getting wrong. "I'll need time to review these," he said. Lord Ashby nodded, satisfied. Of course, no rush." There was a rush. James could feel it in the room, in his mother's stillness, in the solicitor already repacking his case with the efficiency of a man whose work here was essentially done. "We'll speak more at dinner," Margaret said. Elizabeth was passing the study doorway when the door opened. She hadn't meant to be there. She had been returning the linens to the storage cupboard at the end of the corridor, and the study was simply on the way, and she had not known the door was about to open, or that James would be standing just inside it, or that she would catch, very clearly, in the moment before anyone noticed her, the tail end of what Lord Ashby was saying to the solicitor in a satisfied undertone. "The arrangement with the Ashby family Cavendish will come around. His mother assures me it's all but settled." Elizabeth kept walking. She did not run. She did not stop. She kept her steps even and her chin level, and she walked all the way to the end of the corridor and around the corner and down the back stairs and into the cold air of the servants' entrance, where she stood against the stone wall and pressed her palms flat against it and breathed. All but settled. She had stayed for 15 days, no, 18. It had been 18 days now, in a cold room, in a borrowed apron, carrying linens and laying fires and swallowing everything Margaret had handed her, because she had let herself believe, that James had meant it when he said she would be safe here, that whatever was unspoken between them was simply waiting for the right moment. She was so tired of waiting. She was so tired of surviving things that should never have happened to her in the first place. She pushed off the wall. She went upstairs to the third-floor east corridor. She opened the door to her small, cold room and looked at her single trunk sitting at the foot of the bed. Then she sat on the edge of the mattress and put her face in her hands. Not yet, she told herself. Don't decide yet. Wait until you've spoken to him. She waited. James did not come. He didn't come that evening. Dinner was formal, Lord Ashby at the table, Victoire beside him, Margaret at the head with that particular satisfaction she wore like a second dress. Elizabeth was not invited to the main table. A tray was sent up to the third floor. She looked at it for a long time before eating mechanically, without tasting anything. She told herself James was managing guests. She told herself he was tired from the road. She told herself there were 100 reasonable explanations for why a man who had said this conversation isn't finished had not finished it. She was good at telling herself things. She had been doing it for years. He came in the morning. Elizabeth was in the small sitting room off the back corridor, one of the few rooms Margaret hadn't found a reason to remove her from mending a tear in her traveling dress, the one she had arrived in, the one that was not gray and did not have a white apron. She heard his knock and said, "Come in," and James entered, closing the door behind him. He looked like he hadn't slept. Good, she thought, and then immediately felt unkind for thinking it. He sat down across from her without being invited, which was so entirely like him. That particular combination of Duke and boy she had always found impossible to be properly angry at, that she had to look back down at her mending to collect herself. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "We have no formal arrangement." "Elizabeth." "That is the correct answer, isn't it?" She kept her voice even. "I am a guest, an informal one, with no income, no family, and no claim on your household or your time. Your mother made that quite clear. A silence. What exactly did she say to you? James said, very quietly. It doesn't matter now. It matters enormously. She set down her mending and looked at him. He was leaning forward, elbows on his knees, watching her with an intensity she recognized. The same look he'd had at 11 when he was trying to work something out and refusing to stop until he had. James, she said, Lord Ashby brought a solicitor. He didn't look away, I know. And the arrangement is not settled, he said. Whatever you may have heard, nothing has been agreed. She studied his face. She wanted to believe him. She had, in fact, been believing him for 18 days, through a cold room and a servant's apron, and a dinner tray sent up to the 3rd floor. She was not certain how much believing she had left. Then what is settled? She asked. Because I have been in this house for 3 weeks, James, and I still don't know what I am here. The question landed between them like something that had needed saying for a very long time. James opened his mouth, and then the door opened. It was Margaret. She didn't knock. She never knocked. It was her house, after all, and she had an instinct for rooms and moments that Elizabeth had come to think of as predatory. She stood in the doorway and took in the scene, James leaning forward, Elizabeth's careful stillness, the charged quality of the air, and her expression arranged itself into something that managed to suggest both apology and satisfaction simultaneously. James, darling, Lord Ashby is asking for you. Something about the northern boundary survey. He has maps. Tell him I'll be there shortly, James said, without turning around. He's rather insistent, you know how he is. A small pause. It won't take long. James looked at Elizabeth. The look said, I'm sorry, again. I'll come back, again. Elizabeth looked back at him and said nothing. He stood, he straightened his coat. He said quietly, we will finish this conversation. Then he followed his mother out of the room. The door clicked shut. Elizabeth sat alone in the small sitting room for a long moment. Then she picked up her mending and set it down again immediately because her hands were not quite steady. She did not see him for the rest of the morning. By afternoon she had tidied her room, written a letter she didn't send, and walked twice around the kitchen garden in the cold. By evening she had talked herself back from the edge of the decision she had been approaching all day. Not yet. Wait. Give him the chance he asked for. It was the housekeeper's young assistant, a gap-toothed girl named Polly, who undid all of it. Polly was not malicious. That was important. She was simply 15 years old and incapable of silence and entirely unaware of the damage a carelessly delivered piece of information could do. She found Elizabeth in the corridor after supper and fell into step beside her with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had decided they were friends, and said, in a tone of breathless excitement, Have you heard? They're saying the engagement's to be announced at the end of the week. Lady Victoire and His Grace. Mrs. Holt says the Duchess has already sent for flowers. Elizabeth stopped walking. Who is saying that? She asked. Her voice came out remarkably normal. She was distantly proud of this. Oh, everyone below stairs, Polly said cheerfully. The solicitor left papers apparently. Signed ones, Mrs. Holt said. Well, nearly signed. Nearly signed. Thank you, Polly, Elizabeth said. She walked upstairs. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a long time. Nearly signed might mean anything. It might mean nothing. It might mean James had been cornered into initialing something preliminary and hadn't had the chance to explain. It might mean exactly what it sounded like. She thought about what she knew, not what she hoped, not what she had told herself on cold nights in this cold room, what she actually knew. She knew that James had brought her here without a clear declaration. She knew he had left her here alone with his mother after 3 days. She knew he had been back for over 24 hours and had managed one interrupted conversation and an apology and nothing else. She knew that downstairs, right now, Lord Ashby's solicitor had left behind papers that were nearly signed, and Victoire's flowers were already ordered. And she knew she had always known, if she was honest, that knowing someone since childhood, feeling warmth toward them, bringing them into your house out of something between protectiveness and old affection, was not the same as choosing them, was not the same as standing up in a room full of people with solicitors and saying, "This one, her, not the other one." She had been waiting for James to stand up. He hadn't stood up. She was so tired. Not the tiredness of one bad night or one bad week. The deep, accumulated tiredness of a woman who had spent years holding things together, her father's debts, her family's name, her own dignity through circumstances that had tried very hard to strip it from her, and who had thought foolishly, briefly, that she had finally found somewhere she could put the weight down. She had been wrong. Again. She got up, she opened her trunk. She began, quietly and methodically, to pack. She told herself she would sleep first, make the decision in the morning when she was rested, when things might look different in the daylight. She lay down in her coat because the room was cold. She stared at the ceiling. Somewhere below, she could hear the faint sound of the house settling into evening. A door, a voice, the distant clink of glassware from the dining room. Normal sounds. The sounds of a house that was not hers and had never been hers and had been telling her so, in Margaret's precise and patient way, from the very first evening. "I do hope you'll be comfortable here, Miss Voss, however long your stay turns out to be." She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, the house was silent and the candle had burned down, and it was somewhere past midnight, and she knew, with the calm certainty of a decision that had already been made while she wasn't paying attention, exactly what she was going to do. She got up. She finished packing. She put on her coat, her own coat, the borrowed one she left folded on the bed, and she picked up her trunk and she opened the door. The corridor was dark and quiet. She walked toward the stairs. The house was completely still. Elizabeth moved through the dark corridor with the careful quiet of someone who had learned over the years to take up as little space as possible. Past the linen cupboard, past the narrow window that faced the stone wall, down the back stairs, one hand on the rail, trunk in the other, each step placed with deliberate softness. She had done this before. Not here, not in this house, but she had packed a trunk in the dark and walked out of a place that no longer had room for her. She knew the particular quality of that silence, the way it pressed against you, the way you had to keep moving or it would stop you entirely. She kept moving, the second floor landing. She should have gone straight to the back entrance. The kitchen door, the servants' exit, out through the courtyard and down the service lane to the road. Clean and invisible, the way Margaret had been trying to make her for 3 weeks. Instead, she stopped. James's study was at the end of the corridor. The door was closed, but there was a thin line of light underneath it. She stood in the dark and looked at that line of light for a long moment. He was awake. Past midnight, and he was awake, and she was standing 20 feet from his door with her trunk in her hand and her coat buttoned to the throat. And if she knocked, if she simply knocked, he would open it and she would have to look at his face, and then she would have to say the things she had been not saying for 3 weeks, and she would have to hear whatever he said back, and she didn't know if she could bear either outcome. If he asked her to stay, she would stay. She knew that about herself and she was not proud of it. She had stayed too long in too many places out of hope and habit, and she could not afford to do it again. She could not spend another month in a cold room in a borrowed apron waiting for a man to choose her out loud. If he didn't ask her to stay, she picked up her trunk. She walked past the door. She did not let herself slow down. She did not look back at the light underneath it. She went down the main staircase, across the entrance hall to the front door, not the servants' entrance. She decided, not at the end, not after everything, and she lifted the latch and opened it and stepped out into the cold dark of early morning. The gravel crunched under her feet. She winced and slowed and picked her way more carefully toward the gate. The air smelled of wood smoke and wet grass, and the particular cold of a country night that has hours still to go before dawn. She did not look back at the house. She was through the gate and 20 yards down the lane when she heard it. Her name. Not Miss Voss, not a shout, just her name in James's voice from somewhere behind her, closer than she expected, as though he had come out of the house very quickly. She stopped. She didn't turn around. His footsteps on the gravel, then on the lane, quieter, then stopping just behind her, a silence. "You were going to leave," he said, without saying anything. "I left a note," she said. Her voice was steady. She was very tired of how steady her voice was. "I read it," a pause. "I release you from any obligation." "Elizabeth, what obligation?" "I never," he stopped, started again. "I saw your light go out 2 hours ago. I've been sitting in that study trying to decide whether to knock on your door." She turned around then because she couldn't help it. He was standing in the lane in his shirt sleeves. No coat, no jacket, entirely unprepared for the cold, with his study lamp in one hand, and an expression on his face that she had not seen since they were children. Open and uncertain and stripped of the careful composure he wore like armor these days. "You're going to freeze," she said, which was not what she had meant to say. "Very possibly," he agreed. "I don't care." She looked at him. He looked at her. The lamp threw a small circle of gold light between them in the dark lane, and beyond it everything was black and cold and very quiet. "Polly told me about the papers," Elizabeth said, "the nearly signed ones." Something crossed his face. "Polly," he stopped, exhaled. "I did not sign anything. I initialed a preliminary document because Lord Ashby's solicitor put it in front of me and I was tired and my mother was in the room and He stopped again. "That is not an excuse. I know that is not an excuse." "No," she said, "it isn't. I should have been clearer. From the beginning. From before I left. I should have." He set the lamp down on the lane wall and pushed both hands through his hair in a gesture she remembered from 30 years ago, when he was 11 and frustrated and trying to work something out. "I brought you here because I couldn't think of anywhere else you'd be safe, and I wanted you near, and I told myself I was being practical about it, and I was lying to myself, Elizabeth. I have been lying to myself about you for a very long time." The cold moved between them. "James," she said carefully, "what are you saying?" "I'm saying I should have said it weeks ago." He looked at her directly, the way he had always looked at her, like she was something he had been trying to find the right words for his entire life. "I'm saying I don't want you to leave. I'm saying I should have told my mother from the first day that you were not a guest, that you were." He stopped. "I'm making a mess of this." "You are rather," she said. "I know." Another silence, longer this time. An owl called somewhere in the dark fields. Elizabeth looked at the man standing in his shirt sleeves in a cold country lane at 1 in the morning, lamplight catching the lines around his eyes, and thought about apples on a stone wall. About the way he had said her name at the front door on the first day, like it was simply the correct word for something. About 18 days of cold rooms and borrowed aprons, and telling herself to wait, just wait. She was so tired of waiting. But she was also, she realized, still here, still standing in this lane. She had had 20 yards of open road and she had stopped when he called her name and she had turned around, and that said something about her that she might as well be honest about. "If you want me to stay," she said, "then say so, plainly. No more half-conversations and interrupted sentences and nearly signed documents. Say it plainly, James, or I will walk down this lane and you will not come after me." He was quiet for just a moment, just long enough for her heart to do something she would not forgive it for later. Then he said, "Stay, please. I am asking you properly to stay. A beat. And Lady Victoire. I will speak to Lord Ashby in the morning. The arrangement is finished. And your mother." Something shifted in his face, settled into a quiet, final sort of determination. I will speak to my mother as well." Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment. The lamp flickered in a gust of wind. He was visibly cold now, jaw tight, but he didn't move, just stood there in the lane waiting for her answer with the patience of a man who understood he had no right to rush her. She picked up her trunk. She walked back through the gate. She did not look at him as she passed, but she heard him exhale just once, just briefly, and she allowed herself, in the dark where he couldn't see her face, the smallest possible smile. "You should go inside," she said. "You'll catch your death." "Yes," he said, picking up the lamp, "probably." They walked back to the house without touching, without speaking, 3 feet of cold night air between them. But at the front door Elizabeth stopped, and James stopped beside her, and she turned and looked at him one more time. "Plainly," she said, "next time from the beginning." "From the beginning," he agreed. She went inside. Margaret came down to breakfast at precisely 7 o'clock the following morning to find James already at the table, dressed, composed, and waiting for her. He did not stand when she entered. He did not pour her tea. He simply looked at her across the table and said, very quietly, "Sit down, Mother. We need to talk." Margaret looked at her son's face. Something in her expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, almost nothing, before she arranged it back into its usual composure. She sat down. The conversation with his mother lasted 40 minutes. James had prepared for shouting from her, not from him. Margaret was not a woman who shouted. She was a woman who went very still and very cold and chose her words with the precision of someone who understood that a well-placed sentence could do more damage than any raised voice. She did not disappoint. She began with concern. Maternal, measured concern for James's judgment, his responsibilities, the weight of the dukedom and what it required of the man who carried it. She spoke about the Ashby connection, the money, the land, the social alignment, with the fluency of someone who had been rehearsing the argument for weeks. She spoke about Elizabeth with a particular brand of gentleness that was somehow worse than open cruelty. That poor girl, such a difficult situation, of course one feels for her, but feeling is not a foundation, James, and sentiment is not a plan. James listened to all of it. Then he said, "You sent me to Derbyshire on purpose." A pause. The estate matter was genuine. "The estate matter had been resolved for 3 weeks before you told me about it. I spoke to the solicitor there. He was quite clear on the timeline." Margaret's hands rested in her lap, perfectly still. "You arranged for me to be absent," James continued, "and then you gave her a servant's uniform and moved her to the 3rd floor and invited Lord Ashby and his solicitor while I was gone. That is what happened." Margaret said nothing. "I would like you to tell me that I am wrong," James said. "I would very much like that." The morning light came through the breakfast room windows and lay across the table between them, and Margaret looked at her son with an expression that was, for just a moment, entirely unguarded. Not guilty, exactly, but not innocent either. The expression of a woman who had done exactly what she had done and believed, genuinely believed, that she had been right to do it. "I was protecting you," she said finally. "That is what I have always done." "From Elizabeth Voss," James said. "You were protecting me from Elizabeth Voss. From a woman with no money, no family, no position, and a history that would invite gossip from every." "That is enough." He said it quietly. The same tone he had used at the start of the conversation, and Margaret stopped, because she knew that tone, had heard it before, in his father, in the particular frequency that meant the discussion was over, and what followed would simply be a statement of fact. "You will apologize to her," James said. "Not today, because I don't think either of you is ready for that today, but you will, and you will not speak to her again the way you have spoken to her in this house." "James, Lord Ashby will be told this morning that there is no arrangement. I'll speak to him myself." He stood. "The Ashby family will find another duke. There are several. He left the breakfast room. Lord Ashby took it well, all things considered. He was a practical man at heart, affable and loud and ultimately motivated by outcomes rather than sentiments, and James was direct with him in a way that left very little room for negotiation. The Ashby connection was finished. The papers, initialed and nearly signed, were returned across the desk. The solicitor, summoned again, repacked his leather case with the expression of a man for whom this was not the first time and would not be the last. Victoire was told by her father. James did not see her reaction. He heard later from Mrs. Holt that she had ordered her trunk packed within the hour and been entirely composed about it, which he found entirely believable. Victoire had never wanted him particularly. She had wanted the title, the house, the position, all of which would be available in time from someone else. He hoped she found them. He meant that sincerely. By noon, the Ashby carriage was gone. He found Elizabeth in the garden. She was sitting on the stone bench near the far wall, the one that caught the afternoon light, with a book open in her lap that she wasn't reading. She looked up when she heard his footsteps on the path and watched him cross the garden toward her with an expression he was learning to read, the careful, waiting stillness she wore when she wasn't certain what was coming next. He sat down beside her. "It's done," he said. She looked at him. "Lord Ashby." "Gone, the papers are destroyed." He paused. "I spoke to my mother as well." A silence. The garden was very quiet, the kind of quiet that only happens in the middle of the day when everyone has found somewhere else to be. "How did she take it?" Elizabeth asked. "About as well as you'd expect." "Meaning badly?" "Meaning she believes she was right and will continue to believe she was right for some time." He looked at the wall across the garden, old stone, ivy, the same wall he had climbed as a boy. "She may come around. I'm not certain it matters at the moment." Elizabeth said nothing. She closed the book in her lap and set it on the bench beside her and looked at her hands for a moment. "James," she said, "I need to ask you something." "Ask." "Last night in the lane," she stopped, started again. "You said things, in the cold, in the dark, without your coat on, after midnight. I want to know if you meant them in the daylight." He turned to look at her fully. She was looking back at him, direct and steady and just slightly braced, the way she always looked when she was asking something that mattered. "I meant every word," he said. "More clearly in the daylight, if anything. I can see you better." Something moved in her expression. Not quite a smile yet, something that was becoming one. "You've made rather a mess of this," she said. "I know. The uniform alone." "I know. 3 weeks, James." "I know." He held her gaze. "I intend to spend a considerable amount of time making up for it if you'll allow me to." She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was in her hair and she was wearing her own dress, not the gray one, not the apron, and she looked, he thought, like herself. Like the girl from the neighboring estate who had once accepted an apple from a stone wall without ever mentioning to him that she knew perfectly well who had left it there. "Plainly," she said. "You said plainly." "Plainly," he agreed. "I would very much like to marry you, Elizabeth Voss. I should have said so before I left for Derbyshire. I should have said so before I brought you here. I should frankly have said so at several points over the last 20 years, but I was an idiot and I'm asking now, and I would like very much for you to say yes." The silence that followed was the longest 3 seconds of his life. Then Elizabeth said, "You were not an idiot for 20 years." "I was, rather." "Fine." A pause. "You were." And then she smiled, properly, fully, the smile he had been trying to earn since he was 11 years old and too shy to hand her an apple directly, and said, "Yes." He told her later, over tea in the small sitting room that had been her only real refuge in the house, that he had found out the full extent of what happened during his absence, not from Margaret, not from Mrs. Holt, but from Polly, the gap-toothed housemaid who had delivered the nearly signed news, and who had apparently also, in a fit of conscience, delivered a very thorough account of the preceding 3 weeks to James when he had happened to ask her, gently, how things had been. "Polly," Elizabeth said. "Polly," James confirmed. "She told me about the engagement," Elizabeth said. "She nearly destroyed everything." "She also saved everything," James said. "She told me about the uniform." Elizabeth looked into her teacup. "I put it on," she said, "because I had nowhere to go and I wasn't ready to stop believing in you." James was quiet for a moment. Then, very carefully, he reached across and covered her hand with his. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry it cost you what it did." She looked at their hands, his over hers, warm and certain, the way she had not let herself imagine it being. "Don't do it again," she said. "Never," he said. She believed him. The wedding was small. James had offered her anything she wanted, the full ceremony, the county families, the cathedral in the nearest city with its cold stone floors and magnificent windows and seating for 400. Elizabeth had looked at him across the breakfast table when he said this and said, "The garden, 20 people, Tuesday." He had said, "Perfect." It was a Thursday in the end, because the weather on Tuesday was dreadful and Elizabeth refused to be married in the rain on principle. But Thursday was clear and cold and bright, the kind of early spring day that looks like a painting, sharp light, pale sky, the first green pushing up through the beds along the garden wall. The stone bench where James had asked her, where she had said yes, was visible from where they stood. She had looked at it once briefly before the ceremony began. Then she had looked forward. She did not wear white. She wore a dress the color of winter cream, not quite ivory, not quite gold, somewhere in between, that she had made with the help of Mrs. Holt's niece, who turned out to have extraordinary hands with fabric and had cried twice during the fittings for reasons she declined to explain. At her collar she wore her mother's brooch, the one thing from the old house that the creditors hadn't reached, small and silver and shaped like a sprig of leaves. She had looked at herself in the mirror that morning for a long time. She thought about the trunk, the borrowed coat she had left folded on the bed in the third-floor room. Someone had found it and returned it to her without comment, which she had appreciated. She thought about the gray dress and the white apron and the cold room and the stone wall outside the window. She thought about her father, who would have wept at this, genuinely this time for her. She thought about a stone wall with apples on it. Then she had picked up her mother's brooch and pinned it at her collar and gone downstairs. James was waiting at the end of the garden path. He was not supposed to see her before the ceremony. Mrs. Holt had been very firm on this point and had recruited 2 housemaids to enforce it. Both housemaids had apparently been thoroughly outmaneuvered, because James was standing in the garden in full view of the house a full 20 minutes before the vicar arrived, and when Elizabeth came through the door he turned around immediately, as though he had known the exact moment she would appear. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You bribed them," she said. "Generously," he agreed. She came down the path toward him and he held out his hand, and she took it, simply, without ceremony, the way you take the hand of someone you have known for 30 years and will know for 30 more. "Nervous?" he asked. "No," she said, which was true. She was many things moved, uncertain about the future in the way anyone is uncertain about the future, still faintly astonished that she was standing in this garden in this dress on this particular Thursday, but she was not nervous. Nervous implied doubt, and she had none. "Good," he said, "neither am I." He was lying. She could tell by his left hand, which was doing the thing it always did when he was trying not to show what he was feeling, a slight tension in the fingers, almost imperceptible. She said nothing about it. She simply held his hand a little more firmly and felt the tension ease. Margaret did not come. James had told Elizabeth a week before the wedding, quietly and without drama, that his mother had decided to spend the spring at the family's smaller property in Somerset. He had said it in a tone that suggested the decision had not been entirely Margaret's own, and Elizabeth had not asked for details. She had not, in the end, received the apology James had promised. She was not certain she ever would. She had thought about this carefully over the preceding weeks, lying awake in her new room, the good one, south-facing, warm, and had arrived at a peace with it that surprised her. Margaret was what she was. Elizabeth had survived worse and would not spend her marriage waiting for a woman like that to become a different woman. What she had instead was this. A Thursday in early spring, 20 people in a garden, James's left hand slowly unknotting in hers. It was enough. It was more than enough. The vicar arrived at 11 o'clock, slightly out of breath, having apparently taken the wrong lane from the village and had to double back. He was a kind-faced elderly man who stumbled twice over his own notes and made everyone laugh at a moment that wasn't intended to be funny and was somehow better for it. When he asked James if he took Elizabeth Voss to be his wife, James looked at her and said, "I do," with such uncomplicated certainty that somewhere behind her she heard Mrs. Holt make a sound she was generously going to assume was a cough. When he asked Elizabeth if she took James Cavendish, Duke of Ashford, to be her husband, she said, "I do," in a voice that was steady and clear and entirely her own. Afterward, when the small gathering had moved inside for warmth and wine, and Mrs. Holt's extraordinary cake, Elizabeth slipped back out to the garden alone for a moment. She stood by the stone bench in the afternoon light, her mother's brooch at her collar, and she let herself be still. She thought about everything that had brought her here, the debts, the lost house, the trunk packed in the dark, the gray dress folded on a bed she hadn't chosen. She thought about the lane at midnight and James in his shirt sleeves and the lamp on the wall and "Stay, please, I am asking you properly." She thought about all the moments she had nearly not made it to this one. Then she stopped thinking about it, because James appeared in the doorway behind her and said, "Your husband is looking for you," in a tone of such transparent self-satisfaction that she laughed out loud, properly, fully, the way she hadn't laughed in longer than she could remember. "My husband," she said, "should come out here then." He came out. He stood beside her. They looked at the garden together in the thin spring light, the stone wall, the old ivy, the bench, the path down which she had walked toward him that morning. "Regrets?" he asked, not seriously. She could hear the smile in it. "None," she said. And that was the truth, the whole uncomplicated, astonishing, hard-won truth of it, none at all. Somewhere in the manor on the third floor at the end of the east corridor, a small cold room sat empty. The fireplace was clean. The window had been repainted. Mrs. Holt had quietly relocated the linen storage and converted it into something more useful. No one mentioned it. No one needed to. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.